Thank you very much for coming along. It is a really, really important topic because when we talk about children in temporary accommodation, what we're actually talking about is homeless children that you can't see because they aren't sleeping rough on the street. And invisible homelessness, I think, is something that passes under the political radar because it isn't kind of visually inconvenient to anyone. But the impact of being homeless on these children's lives is huge, and it's a scandal, and it's a growing problem. So it's something that we really need to be on the front foot of, and really holding the new government's feet to the fire to have a strategy to deal with this. And before I kind of carry on, I will say I'm reasonably optimistic about the new government having a strategy to deal with this, but we need to keep them on their toes and make sure they do it. So, you know, what's it like for children living in temporary accommodation? So first of all, some numbers. There's been a massive increase in the number of children living in temporary accommodation. The numbers I had at March last year was a 14% increase over the previous calendar year. And that's children who are essentially living in a hotel room, a one-room setup with one or both parents. And the reason they're there usually is because there's not enough social housing to find them somewhere safe to go when their current housing arrangements come to an end. And the reason their current housing arrangements come to an end is usually because of a Section 21 no-fault eviction. So those are the two things that we need to think about. But before we go on to solutions, which I think are actually, thankfully, relatively straightforward, if not that quick to deliver, we just need to think about the impact that having no home has on those children. So something that struck me, having shared a room with someone over conference, is the sleep deprivation that comes with sharing a sleeping space with somebody whose sleeping hours aren't necessarily the same as yours. And for a child, that has a huge knock-on impact onto their mental well-being, their long-term health, their ability to concentrate at school or on whatever else they might be doing. So even just a simple thing of sleep deprivation, it has a potentially a lifelong impact on that child. I'm sure everyone can imagine that if you're in temporary accommodation and it's not in the same place that you previously lived, there's a huge impact on your school career because you might be forced to go to school somewhere else. You might be forced to make new friends, to leave behind your old network of support. And again, it's disruptive to your education, which has a lifelong impact. But there's also a huge mental health impact on these children from constantly having their social network broken up without sort of proper planning and support being around it, like there might be for a family who's moving because of a change in career. There's an impact on nutrition because lots of hotel rooms don't have cooking facilities. So you're looking at families who are living on pot noodles, maybe toast if they're lucky enough to have a toaster. They're not eating healthy, balanced, nutritious food. They're very much eating ultra-processed food. And again, there's a lifelong health impact from doing that. So that's really serious. And I'm sure your presentation is going to highlight more of the issues going than I have, but also the fact that you might not be able to register with a doctor or a dentist means that, again, you're not getting those regular checkups that you might otherwise be getting. So there's a lifelong health impact for these children. And just finally, the insecurity of not having a safe home has a huge mental health impact as well. So it's a really serious situation, and one that we should be really worried about and frankly be looking at ourselves and asking ourselves how we've got into this situation. But we know how we've got into this situation, actually, don't we? Because we haven't built enough social housing for decades. Social housing comes out of the system every single year, whether that's through right to buy or whether that's through housing associations selling old housing stock and not replacing it very quickly, and it doesn't get replaced. And so we've now got over 8 million families with some kind of unmet social housing need. And in the worst situations, there are people who end up in temporary accommodation. And the other thing I mentioned at the beginning was Section 21 no-fault evictions. So the biggest factor in the increase in homelessness is Section 21 no-fault evictions. And sometimes landlords use those evictions for genuine reasons, But increasingly, they're being used by unscrupulous landlords as a way of putting the rent up or getting rid of a tenant who's complaining about infestation or cold or mold or something else that they just can't be bothered to deal with. So they evict, and in the overheated private rental market, they can evict and find someone else to move into that house very quickly. And so that's the real driver behind the huge increase in homelessness that we've seen over the last few years. So what are the solutions? Well, ending Section 21 no-fault eviction has to be a top priority. Now, in the previous government, just before the election was called, the Renters Reform Bill was going through government. I sat on the Bill Committee, and the Conservatives sort of committed to end Section 21 no-fault eviction. Now, I say sort of because they legislated, well, they were planning to legislate for it, but they watered that commitment down by saying, well, if all the no-fault grounds for eviction have to go through a court, and there might still be valid no-fault grounds for eviction, for example, if a landlord needs to sell their property because of a change in circumstances, for example. If they have to go through a court for every time there's a no-fault eviction, the courts will never cope. So we're going to put that off until court reform has happened at some indeterminate point in the future, and then we'll say you can't use a Section 21. So the Conservatives had planned to kick the end of Section 21 down the road. They planned to kick that can down the road, and then the election was called. The legislation having been held up, the election was called and it fell away. The good news is the Labour government reintroduced a very, very similar piece of legislation last week. And we're hoping, and I think they will, go much faster with pushing that through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So I'm hoping that we will see the end of Section 21 no-fault evictions kind of in the next 12 months. And I think that's a massive step forward for the country. And we've talked a lot at conference about being a constructive opposition to Labour. And this is one area where we will absolutely support them in ending Section 21, because it's an important step. We backed them in committee stage with the Conservatives' Renters Reform Bill, and we'll be backing them through the passage through the Houses of Parliament with the new bill. And if it needs improving, we'll definitely be there to improve it. We need to see the detail before we commit to that. But we'll be absolutely backing them in ending Section 21 as quickly as possible. And that's sort of a fix, but it isn't the only thing that we need to do, because the reason we have to start now interfering in the private rented sector with all sorts of legislation to stop landlords reacting to the market is because the market is broken and it's wildly overheated. There are far too many people trying to rent in the private rented sector. And the solution that we have as Liberal Democrats to that, and I think it's the right solution, is to rapidly accelerate the building of new homes for social rent. So whether they're delivered by councils or whether delivered by housing associations, I don't think that matters. But what does matter is that we deliver those homes in the places where we need them as quickly as possible. So our target, which we passed at conference last year, is 150,000 new homes for social rent a year by the end of this Parliament. Now, we'd like to be able to say this year, but we're kind of realistic about getting the skills and the infrastructure in place in local authorities to be able to do that. But it absolutely has to be an ambition for the next 4 or 5 years to ramp that delivery of social homes up. And they need to be targeted in the places where the private rental sector is most overheated. So that's essentially the plan. We can't have all these hidden homeless people in temporary accommodation incurring all these long-term impacts to their health and well-being, which is a disaster for those individuals, but also incredibly costly for the taxpayer for the rest of their lives as well. We need to stop the immediate problem, and then we need to have the long-term solution, which is to find safe and secure housing for people that need it, and that there is no other solution, in my view. So I'm happy to hear extra solutions in this session, but I don't think we can get away from building more social housing.